The bus rumbled through the quiet streets of small-town America, the wheels drumming a rhythm foreign to men who had spent the past years marching through mud, rubble, and ruin. Inside, a handful of German prisoners sat stiffly, their uniforms still bearing the dust and grime of a European winter long past, their eyes shadowed with fatigue and suspicion. Every so often, one would glance through the window, taking in the neatly trimmed lawns, the bright colors of painted houses, the absence of barricades or rubble. It was a world that, until this moment, had existed only in rumor or propaganda leaflets. They were led to a local supermarket, a building whose glass doors reflected a sun-drenched world they barely recognized. Inside, the air smelled sweet, almost aggressively so, a mixture of fresh bread, polished wood, and the subtle tang of fruit. And then the shelves revealed themselves in full, row upon row of bread, meats, cheeses, canned goods, even coffee stacked high as if gravity itself had bowed to abundance. One man froze in place, eyes wide, as he reached for a loaf of bread heavier than any he had held in months. Another ran a hand along the polished jars of preserves, marveling at the uniformity, the endless choice. They had been raised on ration cards, on scraps and substitutes, on meals calculated down to the last calorie by a government stretched thin by war and ideology. In their minds, Germany had been a fortress of strength, a well-oiled machine of order and purpose. Yet here before them was a different kind of power, a quiet abundance that needed no army to enforce it, no propaganda to defend it, no ration cards to regulate it. Some whispered to each other, disbelief coloring their voices. How can a country feed itself like this? A young corporal, barely 20, shook his head. This is more than food. This is life without fear, without hunger, without counting each morsel as if it were gold. It was a revelation of something deeper than nutrition. It was a glimpse into a society that could provide, sustain, and prosper even while the world around it was collapsing. As they moved through the aisles, there were small human gestures, a tentative touch of a fruit's smooth skin, a careful lift of a coffee can, the quiet inhale of a spice that smelled unfamiliar yet inviting. No one spoke of their own homes, of the bombed-out streets of Cologne or Dresden, yet the comparison was inevitable. The absence of cues, of scarcity, of fear, pressed on their minds with a subtle weight. Here, there was enough for everyone. There, survival had been a daily negotiation with fate. A clerk smiled at them, an ordinary, kind smile offering help with canned goods. The men, uncertain how to respond, nodded stiffly. The contrast between this generosity and the disciplined, often harsh structure of their own country's wartime rules gnawed at them quietly. The illusion of German invincibility, of a Reich capable of delivering greatness and security, began to crumble silently in each mind. By the time they left, baskets laden with items that would have been considered luxuries back home, there was a lingering, unspoken acknowledgement. The war had taken much, but this was the first evidence that it had not taken everything from the world. For these men, it was more than food. It was a revelation of what their Reich could never deliver. A silent, unnerving truth settled among them. The war had not only tested their bodies, but their illusions of a nation's greatness. And somewhere in the heart of that small-town supermarket, they glimpsed the reality of a world that had moved beyond the hunger, beyond the fear, a world they might never truly touch. The bus doors closed, the wheels began to turn, and outside, the sun continued to shine, oblivious to the small, seismic shift that had occurred inside a handful of weary soldiers' minds. Winter in Germany was more than a season. It was a test of endurance, a slow erosion of body and spirit. By late 1944, the promises of the Reich, of a nation that could sustain its people, its armies, its dreams of empire, had begun to crumble under the relentless pressure of war. In towns and villages, in the rubble-strewn streets of cities like Cologne and Essen, the hunger was constant. Meat, butter, and even bread had become scarce luxuries. Families lined up for hours at communal bakeries, clutching ration cards that determined whether they would eat at all. The Allied blockades, relentless and precise, had cut Germany off from critical imports: grain, sugar, fats. Farmers struggled to bring in harvests under the threat of bombing, and fuel shortages left transport in chaos. For soldiers on the front, rations were a pale reflection of sustenance. Thin soups, ersatz coffee, and whatever scraps could be pushed to the lines. Even the famed Wehrmacht's food supply, once a model of logistical efficiency, had degraded into a patchwork of improvisation and scarcity. Letters from the front spoke not of glory, but of hunger, gnawing at uniforms stiffened by frost, of men weighing each bite as if it were a small act of strategy. Propaganda had promised abundance. The Reich had painted a vision of strength, discipline, and plenty, convincing its citizens that scarcity was temporary, that victory would restore the table to overflowing. Yet reality told another story. Bakers rationed flour to fractions of a pound. Butchers handed over thin slices of meat, barely enough to fill a child's hand. Milk was reserved for children and the elderly. Sugar became a memory, something tasted in secret, a luxury whispered about. Hunger gnawed not just at the stomach, but at morale, at the very notion that the Reich could protect and provide for its own. By December 1944, the Ardennes forest became the stage for the last desperate gamble of a regime fraying at the edges. Soldiers advancing into the snow knew that their stomachs ached more than their boots, that victory meant little if there was nothing to sustain it. Civilians, huddled in bombed-out apartments, scavenged for roots, bark, and whatever stores the local authorities could allocate. Every table became a battlefield, every meal a negotiation with survival. Yet for all the deprivation, the narrative of the Reich persisted. Men and women clung to it like lifelines, reciting slogans, praising the Führer, believing that hunger was a temporary inconvenience, a small sacrifice on the road to greatness. But the cracks were undeniable. Morale faltered as food disappeared. In quiet whispers behind closed doors, families compared their rations to the rumors of Allied abundance. The contrast was growing too stark to ignore, and so, while Germany starved and the promise of plenty fell into ruin, across the ocean, a very different story was unfolding. In towns hundreds of miles away from bombed-out streets, the shelves were stocked, the refrigerators full, the air scented with the promise of sustenance unbounded. Soldiers and civilians alike in the United States moved through aisles of abundance, unaware of the silent despair that gripped the other side of the Atlantic. The Reich's illusions of invincibility, of provision, of control over life itself were being shattered not by guns alone, but by the quiet, unyielding arithmetic of scarcity. And somewhere in those distant sunlit supermarkets, the captured German soldiers would witness a truth more unsettling than any battle, that survival was not merely about conquest or courage, but about the capacity to feed a nation, to sustain its people, to protect its future. The German prisoners had never seen anything like it. Outside the supermarkets, the streets of small American towns seemed orderly, sunlit and calm, but it was what lay within that struck them with a near-physical force. Endless aisles of fresh produce, perfectly stacked cans, and refrigerated shelves seemed to defy reason. Oranges glowed like captured sunlight. Apples were round, red, unblemished, a stark contrast to the bruised, rationed fruit they had seen in Germany. Loaves of bread, thick, aromatic, and plentiful, lined shelves in perfect rows. Meat, butter, cheese, commodities they had dreamed of, were abundant, labeled and packaged, ready for anyone to take. In the Midwest, farms stretched across the horizon in tidy grids, fields brimming with wheat, corn, and potatoes. Grain elevators towered over towns like monuments to productivity. Mechanized tractors plowed vast expanses, harvesting with an efficiency unimaginable to men who had spent weeks hand-reaping small plots, often under enemy fire. The American food machine was industrial, relentless and precise, from the farm to the factory to the store. Canning and refrigeration meant that food could travel hundreds of miles without spoiling. Logistics ensured that even the most rural towns never lacked essentials. For these soldiers, it was not just a supermarket. It was a window into a world where hunger was optional, not a daily certainty. The POWs moved slowly through the aisles, whispering to each other. Every glance, every touch of a polished can or a jar of jam revealed the magnitude of what they were witnessing. To them, it seemed like magic. The idea that a society could feed itself, sustain millions, and maintain abundance in the midst of war. There were no queues, no ration cards, no confiscations. Food existed freely, as if the earth itself had conspired with industry to offer its bounty without constraint. Behind the abundance, however, lay a system of innovation and resilience that the men began to understand. Rail lines delivered produce from coast to coast. Refrigerated boxcars preserved milk, meat, and fruit across hundreds of miles. Canning factories employed thousands, preserving seasonal harvests for months. Even small towns were linked to regional supply centers, guaranteeing a steady flow of essentials. It was a logistical ballet, precise, mechanical, and relentless, a choreography of abundance that contrasted sharply with the chaos and scarcity of their own nation. As they walked, a young soldier picked up a jar of peanut butter, turning it in his hands, astonished. "Back home," he murmured, "we would trade a week's rations for something like this." Another reached for a bottle of soda, popping it open with a mixture of awe and hesitation, afraid that taking it might be some mistake. Each encounter deepened a sense of dislocation, a feeling that this was not merely another country, but another reality altogether. And then came the inevitable comparisons. Their ration cards in the Reich could only hope to provide the bare minimum: thin soups, ersatz coffee, powdered milk, a slice of bread no thicker than a handspan. Here, every item on the shelf represented choice, indulgence, and abundance. Their stomachs, long trained to measure each bite, struggled to comprehend that they could eat freely, without fear of deprivation tomorrow. By the time they left, the POWs carried small baskets of food, their movements tentative, almost reverent. The reality of American abundance had begun to weigh on them, an unspoken burden pressing against the pride they had once felt in their nation. It was not just wealth or industry they were witnessing. It was a moral and psychological contrast, a quiet indictment of the regime they had served. And when the prisoners compared their rations, the contrast was devastating. Barbed wire ran in neat, parallel lines across the camp, fencing in hundreds of weary German soldiers. Yet inside, the routines were nothing like the harsh discipline of the front. Here the clatter of mess hall trays replaced the rattle of gunfire. The aroma of freshly baked bread mingled with the scent of roasted meat and simmering vegetables, a sensory assault that left some men silently trembling. For many, it was the first time in years that a meal was not a negotiation with hunger, but an act of simple consumption. The POWs moved through the long mess hall, trays in hand, eyes wide. The portions were generous: eggs for breakfast, meats for lunch and dinner, butter thickly spread on bread, fresh fruit when available. Nutritionists employed to maintain health and morale calculated each meal to provide more calories than a soldier might receive on the European front. Some men, accustomed to subsisting on thin soups and rations of flour, found themselves gaining weight, a small, bewildering luxury. Letters home, smuggled or carefully censored, brimmed with disbelief. One corporal wrote to his mother, "Here, even prisoners eat like kings. We are fed with a care I could never have imagined. Bread, meat, butter, more than we see in months at the front." The lines between privilege and guilt blurred. They had been trained to believe that surrender was shameful, that captivity was punishment. Yet here, within fences and under watchful eyes, they were treated with an almost paternal concern. Meals became a silent reminder of the world they had lost, and of the world that could exist beyond the Reich's collapsing promise. Even the smallest details were meticulously arranged. Tables were clean, utensils polished, and every serving designed to maximize nourishment. The cooks, many young Americans still of draft age, worked efficiently and cheerfully, unaware of the profound psychological impact their efforts had on the men they fed. Some POWs lingered, tasting butter on bread, savoring the richness of milk, marveling at the sheer quantity of fruit. Each bite seemed a revelation, a confirmation that survival did not have to be desperate, that sustenance could be plentiful, steady, and predictable. In the evenings, the camp held quiet communal dinners, where men shared stories not of battle, but of wonder at the abundance around them. Conversations moved from disbelief to introspection. Why, one whispered to another, could our leaders not feed us like this? Others avoided the question, fearing that acknowledgement would erode their pride, that recognition of such contrast would make their losses feel deeper. Yet even as they spoke, they were forced to confront a truth that had been growing in the back of their minds since first entering the United States. Survival is not only about courage or strategy. It is about provision, logistics, and foresight. The physical transformation was matched by a psychological one. Where soldiers had been thin, anxious, and wary, now there was a slow easing, a subtle reclaiming of human rhythm. They laughed more easily, lingered longer at tables, and felt the strange luxury of anticipation for the next meal. Yet beneath the laughter, beneath the growing sense of ease, there was a quiet, unspoken tension. Each bite, each glass of milk reminded them that their own nation had failed to provide, that their sacrifices had been made in the shadow of scarcity. By the time night fell and the lights dimmed over the camp, the men lay in their bunks with full stomachs and racing minds. Barbed wire separated them from the surrounding countryside, yet the world outside seemed almost unreal in its abundance, and beyond those fences, beyond the carefully measured meals, and the orderly routines, the true shock awaited. The morning was crisp and clear, the sun casting long shadows across the camp as the prisoners were lined up for another supervised work detail. They did not march toward battlefields, nor were they sent to clean debris from bombed cities. Today, they were to walk into towns, American towns, and witness something far more disorienting than any artillery barrage: the everyday life of abundance. Escorted by guards, the German men passed through streets lined with brick buildings, painted signs and storefronts that radiated calm and order. Children rode bicycles without helmets or fear. Women pushed shopping carts filled with goods, and the air carried a faint sweetness, the smell of fresh bread mingling with the crisp air. For men who had grown up under ration cards, blockades, and the endless scarcity of wartime Germany, even the streets themselves seemed unreal, orderly, clean, and bustling with life, yet free from tension and fear. And then they entered the stores. At first it was subtle, a loaf of bread stacked high, the crust golden and thick, butter arranged in perfect blocks, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Chocolate, bars upon bars, neatly lined on shelves like treasures meant for everyone. Cans of peas, beans, and fruit extended as far as the eye could see, each label colorful, inviting, and unbroken. Jars of preserves glimmered, bottles of soda fizzed in transparent coolers, and packets of coffee offered a richness they had only heard described in letters or rumor. The men moved slowly, almost hypnotically, their eyes widening at the spectacle. Hands hovered over items as if touching them might dissolve the vision, might break the spell. One soldier, eyes darting between the shelves, and his companions whispered, This is impossible. Every shelf is full. Every shelf. And it's for anyone." Others nodded, speechless, mouths slightly open, staring at the abundance as if it were a natural wonder rather than a store. The psychological weight was immense. Years of hunger, of rationing, of knowing that survival often depended on the smallest, most calculated portion, collided with the reality before them. Here there were no ration cards, no limits, no waiting for a week's allocation. Here, food was abundant, effortless, and ever-present. Every detail screamed normalcy. Polished floors, organized aisles, cashiers ringing up purchases with cheerful efficiency. And yet, it was precisely this normalcy that made it surreal. This was life unbroken by the war. Not a fantasy, not a staged exception, but the standard of everyday living. Some men lingered near the chocolate display, incredulous at the freedom of choice. Others hesitated at the refrigerators, staring at milk, cheese, and butter, still expecting the shelf to empty, still waiting for someone to announce that it was all a trick. Their eyes scanned labels for ingredients, quantities, anything that could explain the abundance, and found nothing. It was simple, functional, and real. The guards noticed the astonishment but said nothing. They walked behind the prisoners, allowing them this rare, disorienting taste of normal life, fully aware of its psychological impact. For the German soldiers, each glance at an overflowing shelf, each smell of fresh-baked bread, each bar of chocolate slipped into their pockets for the walk back to camp, was a quiet, undeniable proof that their world was fundamentally broken. By the time they left the stores, arms laden with purchases, the men were silent, their minds struggling to reconcile the contrast. The Reich's promises of provision, of a nation capable of sustaining its people, had been shattered long before, by war. But here in a small American supermarket, the evidence was tangible, immediate, and visceral. They realized that this was not propaganda. It was reality. For years, the Reich had spun its narrative with relentless precision. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and films painted America as decadent, weak, and teetering on the edge of collapse. Citizens were told that the Allies were mired in chaos, torn apart by racial strife, inflation, and moral decay. Victory for Germany, the propaganda insisted, was inevitable. A march of discipline against a crumbling foe. Soldiers carried this narrative into battle, believing in a world where hunger, rationing, and hardship were the hallmarks of enemy weakness. Yet the prisoners walking through American towns found themselves confronting a reality that contradicted every lesson they had been taught. Streets were orderly, towns were thriving, and communities moved with a calm efficiency that left them unnerved. Children played safely in parks, women shopped freely, and factories churned with a rhythm that suggested a society entirely capable of sustaining itself, its population, and its military effort. Inside the stores, the evidence became undeniable. Bread stacked high, rows of fresh fruit, refrigerated milk, and shelves groaning under cans of food told a story their leaders had never dared admit. This was a society not fractured by scarcity, but empowered by abundance. Chocolate, coffee, and butter were not luxuries, but ordinary commodities, accessible to anyone with money. The careful planning, the logistics of farms, railways, and factories all combined to create a nation where hunger was optional, not inevitable. For the POWs, the contrast was moral as well as physical. Their homeland had demanded sacrifice in the name of ideology, yet could not sustain its own citizens. Here, across the Atlantic, a population thrived without coercion or fear. Soldiers found themselves quietly questioning the righteousness of the struggle they had been trained to uphold. The ideology of scarcity, of struggle as proof of strength, collided violently with the evidence of abundance. Conversations among the prisoners became subdued debates, whispered over trays of food. "We were told they are weak," one murmured, glancing at a refrigerated shelf. "But they are stronger than we imagined, strong enough to feed a nation while we starve." Another shook his head slowly. "All our pride, all our suffering. For what?" Each man carried a private reckoning, weighing the honor of service against the undeniable reality of provision. The empire of scarcity, battered by blockade, overextension and mismanagement, faced an empire of abundance, one built not on fear, propaganda, or coercion, but on logistics, innovation, and planning. For the German soldiers, this was more than disorienting. It was a revelation of the stakes of their failure. Hunger had been a weapon, yes, but the inability to provide had become a moral and psychological liability, eroding the foundations of belief that had been drilled into them from youth. By the end of the day, as they filed out of the stores and returned to the camp, the POWs carried with them a heavy awareness. The food aisles, the stacked shelves, the overflowing refrigerators. They were more than nourishment. They were a lesson in reality, in efficiency, in the quiet power of a society that could thrive while another starved. The food aisles were more powerful than 1,000 speeches. By February 1945, the war had reached a crescendo of logistics and strategy, but few realized that the battlefield extended far beyond the front lines. Somewhere in the heart of the United States, industrial kitchens hummed with quiet efficiency, turning raw ingredients into meals capable of sustaining millions. The process was meticulous, calculated, and relentless, a kind of hidden weapon whose impact rivaled the most sophisticated artillery. Factories churned out canned rations, vacuum-sealed meats, dehydrated vegetables, and powdered eggs. Refrigerated. Ships carried frozen beef and pork across the Atlantic, ensuring that every American soldier in Europe could receive a meal within days of production. Soldiers at training camps, sailors aboard transport ships, and Marines on distant islands all depended on this invisible infrastructure. Here, feeding an army was routine, a system perfected long before the first shell landed in France or the Ardennes. The Germans, in contrast, faced a near-impossible challenge. Allied blockades had choked imports, bombed rail lines, disrupted domestic distribution, and fuel shortages crippled transport. Soldiers on the front lines scavenged for calories, relying on ersatz coffee, thin soups, and whatever could be spared from civilian rations. Civilians endured the same deprivation, ration cards dictating how much butter, sugar, or meat they might receive. For Germany, feeding the army had become a logistical nightmare. Every day brought scarcity, every week more deprivation. When the POWs learned of the scale of the U.S. food effort, disbelief gave way to a grudging respect. They heard of ships carrying thousands of tons of frozen beef, of mobile canning units supplying frontline bases, of scientists calculating caloric intake with military precision. Enticed the mess halls as they ate bread thicker than any rationed loaf back home, soldiers quietly compared the industrial might behind each bite. They began to see the invisible gears turning behind every chocolate bar, every tin of soup, every loaf of bread. The U.S. didn't just feed its citizens and soldiers. It had weaponized the ability to feed, turning logistics into a strategic advantage. The contrast was stark. In Germany, the war had exhausted resources, undermined morale, and left hunger as both a weapon and a consequence. In America, abundance was mobilized with purpose, feeding millions while supporting the global campaign. For the POWs, this became a lesson in scale and efficiency. Hunger was not merely a lack of food, it was a vulnerability, a failure of planning, an enemy more insidious than artillery. Some wrote home about it, describing the factories, the fleets of trucks, the refrigerated trains that seemed to defy distance. Others spoke in hushed tones of the sheer precision. Every meal is calculated, timed, delivered, a machine feeding an army as surely as a cannon fires its rounds. Slowly, the realization settled in, quietly reshaping their understanding of war. This was not a contest of bravery alone, or of weapons alone. It was a contest of capacity, of preparation, of the ability to sustain life in unimaginable quantities. By the end of the week, as they returned to their bunks with full stomachs, the POWs understood a bitter truth. Their nation had fought valiantly, yes, but it had been outproduced before it was outgunned. The Reich had failed not just on the battlefield, but in the factories, in the fields, in the kitchens that determined who would endure and who would starve. The POWs began to understand. Their nation was outproduced before it was outgunned. Even within the fences of the POW camp, the prisoners sought connection to the world they had left behind. Pen in hand, they wrote letters to mothers, fathers, wives, and siblings, careful at first to respect censorship rules, but increasingly candid as days and weeks passed. Their words, often veiled in careful phrasing, carried hints of something that their homeland could scarcely imagine: abundance, ease, and the quiet rhythm of life unbroken by hunger. One corporal described the mess hall in painstaking detail, noting the thickness of bread, the richness of butter, the strange luxury of fresh milk and cheese. Another mentioned the neatly stacked shelves in local stores, the fruit, the chocolate, and the freedom to take what was needed without waiting for weeks. Words that might have seemed trivial to an outsider were revolutionary in context. "Here, even prisoners eat like kings," wrote one young soldier, almost unable to believe it himself. These were not boasts. They were subtle confessions, small truths that hinted at the failure of the Reich to provide even the basics it had promised. Some letters slipped past censors entirely, carried by sympathetic clerks, or lost in the shuffle of wartime bureaucracy. Families on the home front read them with a mixture of awe, disbelief, and guilt. Mothers who had stretched ration cards to their breaking point, fathers who had stood in endless lines for bread, and children who had learned the meaning of hunger, now glimpsed a world that made their sacrifices seem both necessary and futile. The contrast between scarcity at home and abundance abroad became painfully clear. For the POWs, writing these letters was more than a personal exercise. It was a subtle act of witness. They chronicled what the Reich could not admit, that the enemy they had been taught to fear was not starving, that society could function, thrive, and sustain its people while their own families and comrades struggled. The psychological weight of this knowledge pressed heavily. Some men felt guilt, others relief, and many a complex mixture of both. Each word on the page carried the quiet tremor of realization. The world they had fought for no longer matched the world that existed outside their borders. Letters became small lifelines, connecting prisoners to the familiar, even as they described the unfamiliar. Yet they also became instruments of dissonance, planting seeds of doubt in the minds of those who read them. If the enemy could feed its people, if abundance could exist so close to conflict, what did it mean for the war they had been told was righteous and inevitable? What did it mean for the leaders who had promised provision while failing to deliver it? As March 1945 approached and the Allies prepared for the final pushes into Germany, these letters took on an even greater weight. Soldiers wrote not only of food and comfort, but of the logistical brilliance and organization that had allowed the Americans to sustain a global army. In quiet, unassuming ways, the letters documented a truth far more profound than the taste of chocolate or the richness of butter. They documented the collapse of illusions, the slow unspooling of pride, and the unflinching power of preparation and planning. By the time the war drew to a close, the prisoners would carry these memories with them, inscribed not just on paper but in their minds and bodies. The meals, the supermarkets, the careful organization, all of it left a mark that neither victory nor defeat could erase. And when the war ended, those memories would not fade. The war had ended, but the journey of the German prisoners was far from over. Released from American camps, they returned to a homeland of rubble, ash, and lingering hunger. Streets, once familiar, were now reduced to twisted steel and shattered stone. The bread lines and ration cards of wartime persisted in the cities and towns they had known before captivity. Yet within them, they carried memories that clashed violently with this destruction, memories of supermarkets overflowing with food, mess halls laden with butter, meat, and chocolate, of a society that had functioned and thrived even in war. In letters, in conversations with neighbors, and in the quiet corners of coffee houses, these men became chroniclers of a reality previously unknown to their fellow citizens. They spoke of bread stacked higher than any bakery could produce in Germany, of fruit so abundant it seemed unnatural, of milk, cheese, and meat delivered without fear or scarcity. Their words painted a portrait of everyday abundance that contrasted sharply with the ongoing hardships at home. Families who had endured the final months of the Reich in hunger listened, fascinated, sometimes disbelieving, but always profoundly impacted. The psychological effect was profound. For soldiers, the knowledge that survival and comfort were possible reshaped their understanding of governance, logistics, and society. The Reich had promised greatness, discipline, and plenty. Yet the reality they had witnessed abroad revealed a different kind of strength, a strength not measured in weapons alone, but in the ability to sustain a population, to provide for its citizens, to turn industry into a force that nourished as much as it protected. Communities absorbed these tales slowly, almost reluctantly at first. They were uncomfortable truths, a critique of the war that no official report could fully articulate, a silent accusation that the nation had mismanaged its resources and failed its people. Yet the returned POWs were careful. Their purpose was not to sow resentment, but to illuminate what could be possible in a society rebuilt. They described a world where hunger was not inevitable, where logistics, planning, and industrial innovation could ensure security and sustenance for all. In classrooms, in local gatherings, in informal councils of post-war reconstruction, these former prisoners became inadvertent educators. They told of American supermarkets not as exotic oddities, but as templates of efficiency, evidence that societies could organize, produce, and distribute in ways previously thought impossible. Their stories offered hope, not the hope of immediate recovery, but of a future where abundance could replace scarcity, where planning and foresight could safeguard against the vulnerabilities that had brought Germany to its knees. By April 1945, as the Ruhr pocket had collapsed and Germany lay in strategic and moral ruin, these testimonies gained added weight. They were no longer just memories of captivity. They were lessons in resilience, preparation, and the quiet power of organization. Citizens who had suffered alongside them began to see that reconstruction would require more than rebuilding cities. It would demand a reevaluation of values, of priorities, and of the methods by which a nation could sustain its people. The POWs had returned as witnesses, chroniclers of a world that thrived while theirs had starved. Their experiences became a bridge between devastation and recovery, a repository of knowledge that would influence the thinking of a new generation. Germany's future would be rebuilt not just with bricks, but with new ideas about abundance. The sun rose over the small American town one final time for the prisoners, casting long shadows across streets that had become strange, familiar, and yet utterly alien. By now, the men had walked the aisles countless times, eaten countless meals in the orderly mess halls, and marveled at the precision of a society built on abundance. Yet even as the war receded into memory and Europe reeled from devastation, the lessons of those moments remained sharper than any battlefield scar. The supermarket aisles were more than a display of food. They were a reflection of systems, of foresight, of the meticulous orchestration of labor, industry, and logistics. Each loaf of bread, each row of canned goods, each block of butter represented a society capable of sustaining itself under pressure, of translating resources into strength without coercion or fear. To the POWs raised on ration cards, scarcity, and the relentless calculus of survival, it was a revelation. The power of a nation, they realized, did not reside solely in tanks, artillery, or bombs. It resided in the quiet, persistent capacity to provide, to organize, to endure. Walking past the refrigerated shelves one last time, the men noticed details they had previously overlooked. The signage that guided shoppers, the systems for inventory and rotation, the careful labeling that ensured nothing went to waste. This was not mere indulgence. It was strategy, ingenuity, and preparation rendered visible. The abundance was a weapon, but one of a different kind, a weapon of resilience, of continuity, of societal strength that could outlast a blitzkrieg or a battle line. As they paused to watch an American family select items from the shelves, the POWs reflected on the stark contrast with their homeland. In Germany, scarcity had dictated daily life for years. Hunger had been a constant companion, shaping morale, decisions, and ultimately the fate of a nation. In the United States, however, life moved with a rhythm sustained by foresight, by planning, and by the unglamorous labor of millions who never set foot on a battlefield. The soldiers saw that real power was measured not just by conquest, but by the capacity to feed, shelter, and sustain life even amid global conflict. The experience reshaped the prisoners' view of the world. They returned home not only with memories of food and comfort, but with insights into governance, logistics, and societal strength. They spoke of efficiency as a weapon, of industrial organization as strategy, of abundance as an unspoken declaration of resilience. The Reich's failures had been brutal and visible, but here, in the quiet, unassuming shelves of a supermarket, they witnessed a model of sustainable power that transcended ideology. For the men who had once been captives, the transformation was psychological as well as practical. They had come expecting punishment, scarcity, and deprivation. Instead, they encountered abundance, civility, and structure, a reality that forced them to reconsider notions of strength, morality, and the human capacity to endure and thrive. It was a lesson that would linger far beyond the war, shaping conversations, influencing reconstruction, and challenging assumptions about what a society could achieve when its people were nourished, valued, and trusted to participate in the collective good. And so, as the prisoners boarded buses, leaving the aisles behind, they carried with them a quiet, indelible truth. The tanks, the artillery, the bombers, these were instruments of war. But the shelves, stocked and orderly, abundant and reliable, were instruments of enduring power. In the end, what shocked them most was not America's weapons, but its shelves.